welcome everybody to this book launch. This book launch is for two books at the same time. The first one is Inez Holden's There Is No Story There. And the second one is Margaret Kennedy's Where Stands a Wingèd Sentry. Very sadly, we can't meet in person and drink a great deal of fizzy things, so we're going to do a long Zoom instead. And we have special guests. Faye Hamill, could you wave your hand, Faye, so people can see you? Faye Hamill, Professor of English Literature at the University of Glasgow, wrote the introduction to the Margaret Kennedy book. And we also have Lucy Scholes. Lucy, could you wave your hand so people can see you? Lucy Scholes is a literary critic and a journalist who writes from Daily Telegraph, Financial Times, the Paris Review, and I really lose track of all the media organs she appears in. But she's a very knowledgeable person about fiction from the past. She also hosts the Virago Books podcast, whose name I've forgotten. Can you tell me?
Shelves.
Our shelves. We also have a surprise special guest who won't be taking part in the conversation quite as much as Lucy and Faye, but she's also important. Ariane, could you wave your hand? Ariane Banks is the literary executor of Inez Holden, and she knows a lot about Inez from a family perspective and from having had her in her back of her family for quite so long. So she may well be interjecting as we go along. So what we're going to do is have a conversation, and I'm going to start by asking questions of Faye and Lucy. And I'd like to start with Faye, because Kennedy is the older text. Do you think you could talk a little bit about, well, what I wanted to say about Margaret Kennedy, Where Stands a Wingèd Sentry, is that it's packed with emotion. Whereas the Inez Holden text is far less emotional, it's much more dispassionate. And I wondered if you could say a few words about how you think that Margaret Kennedy moderated or modulated the use of emotion and rationality in the story she was telling.
Yes, that's interesting, because I have been struck by how restrained she is in lots of ways, how very emotional everybody must have been feeling during this period, and how she manages to kind of keep it all under control in writing this diary. But at the same time, it's very intense. You know, she's telling stories of things which, you know, wouldn't have happened at any other time in her life, of hearing the news of the death of people she knew in London, of close friends, and the continual fears for the safety of her family. So the way that she manages to diffuse that intensity with moments of humour, and with, in fact, the structure of the diary itself, just the continual record that she's making of those moments of intensity. I feel like that's the real that holding of feeling into kind of a rigid structure almost of narrative. So yeah, I think it's actually a less emotional text than some of her novels. There's no kind of excess, there's no kind of floweriness of feeling. It's all kind of alternation between moments of intensity and then diffusing that with moments of humour or relaxation.
And when you think about it, she was writing this during 1940, experiencing the beginning of the war in its true sense. So the phony war was over and things were happening all around the country and in Europe. And she's so focused on Europe. And yet at the same time, she has to deal with the mundanity of packing for evacuation, making sure they've got boots, working out a plan for what they could pick up at a moment's notice if the Germans landed. The balance between practicality and existential terror is really strange. I mean, I think that makes the book as strong as it does, because there is no room for frivolity.
Yes, again, the daily activities are counteracting that experience of stress and terror, aren't they? I mean, the fact that she, as you say, she has to pack certain things, she has to keep the children amused and take them to the beach. That's the kind of sort of undertone of all of these days that are narrated, and provides a counterpoint to those moments of fear, and those moments when something actually does happen, when they learn of the destruction that's happened elsewhere and fear the destruction that's going to happen where they are.
Lucy, if we can turn to you now. Inez Holden's narrative, her novel, is really suffused with fear all the way through. And I wonder if you could say something about how how fear is articulated in the way that Inez Holden wrote the novel.
I think very cleverly because, like you sort of mentioned earlier briefly, it is a book which is written with a great deal of restraint. You know, she's writing in this kind of social documentary style, so she wants to report on what she sees rather than kind of go deep. Though she does sort of go deep into some of the characters' lives, but predominantly this is about kind of, you know, seeing what we see on the day-to-day life at this factory. And so I think fear there is just a part of life, and I think that's what comes out so clearly, that working in this factory and building these bombs and using this kind of incredibly explosive material, it's not like in the previous book you published, or the I've forgotten the title of it now. It was what's the Night
Shift.
Night Shift, of course.
Yes.
Sorry, it's not
That's
like
right,
in Night
yes.
Shift where you have this sort of overarching fear of the bombs, and, you know, is the factory, is it not going to be bombed? In this, every single day the workers are kind of taking their lives into their own hands, and we do see moments where there's a wonderful bit halfway through, for those of you who read it, where there is an accident in one of the rooms where they're building these bombs, and it's written with such restraint. Again, there's no sort of drama around it, there's no sort of melodramatic action in the characters, but this woman dies, and, you know, that's part and parcel of life. And I think that's what's so brilliant about this book, that it sort of seeps into the very fabric of it, and so you're always aware of it, even if she's not sort of shouting in your face danger, danger, danger the whole time.
Yes, that episode where the woman dies, it's so reticently written. You have to go back and read it again. Did I miss something? Did this happen which I thought happened? But because you're not hit with the usual triggers, the usual verbal or visual triggers, by which a death is announced. And for that to happen at this moment in literary history, or even in this moment in the war, is really remarkable. I haven't read anything quite as dispassionate, but yet empathic, as Inez Holden's writing in wartime. She is a remarkable articulator of what the wartime experience was like. Can you say a little bit more about, well, I said dispassionate and also empathic. When you were when you read the novel for the first time, which was a year or two ago, what struck you most? Was it dispassionate, or did you feel, oh, this is an empathic writer?
That's an interesting question. I think she treads a fine line between the two. I mean, I think one of the great things about her, and this is something I've tried to talk about in my introduction, is that she is an incredibly empathetic writer, that she understands the people she's writing about, or she really wants to understand them, and she seems to be able to get into their lives and talk about the reality on a day-to-day basis. But at the same time, she's able to do that without sort of either pitying or becoming too sort of emotionally involved in it. So that lends itself to the sort of more dispassionate style. And I guess what you're saying, it kind of ties in with what you're saying just then, that there's something very fresh and original and really quite modern about her work, which I can't think of finding in anything from this period. I mean, I don't know if Faye, you might know better than me if you come across anything like this, but I think for me, when I first read Holden, and particularly this novel, I was really taken aback by how new and fresh it felt to me, even though ostensibly it's writing about a subject of which I've read a lot about already, and I'm sure we all have. You know, we all know what it's like to have lived through the Second World War to a certain degree, having read stories about it. And this was like nothing else I had come across.
Yeah, Faye, have you read any other Inez Holden? I don't know.
I've only read these two that you've published, and I haven't read any other authors who achieved something similar, I must say.
Yeah. So we had a session on Blitz writing. I think it was the last book club we did, rather than a book launch, in which we talked a lot about Holden's approach to writing people and writing women in the war. And there are women are very dominant in both these texts. And Faye, I wonder, can we have a think about, Margaret Kennedy wrote about women in wartime in a very domestic setting. There's not really much about women in the workplace, whereas the Holden text is full of women in the workplace or women in an institution, because they're not at home, but they have to sleep in an institution. But somehow Margaret Kennedy stops this being yet another book about women's lives at war, which is based about the ration books. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, absolutely, because she talks so much about the political situation, and part of her narrative is about the conversation she's had with all the other women and mothers around her, but they're always talking about politics. They're not talking that much about floor polish, although that does feature. That's a kind of minor thread, and most of the time they're discussing what they think of the different European nations and what's happening out there in the world. So that's one thing, but it's very interesting that she never ever mentions her status as a writer or her work of writing, and she presents herself purely as a wife and mother. So not only do we not have any sense of working outside the home, but we also don't even have any sense of literary work as a form of work. Nevertheless, she creates the impression of being busy all of the time, and that busyness seems to be, I think, largely mental. All the things that she's worrying about seem to absorb a lot of her energies.
Yeah. And I suppose she would be writing the diary, because she does speak of, there's a rather meta moment where she's writing the diary and then interjects with a much later entry to clarify something for the reader, and then pulls back again. And it isn't, apart from those very, very few moments, you forget that this is a constructed narrative, that this is not a novel. This is a diary that's been extracted and selected and presented for publication. Oh, how much artifice do you think is in there? Is it possible to tell?
It's not easy to tell without any manuscript version, but certainly she said herself that the book was based on her journal rather than a direct copy of it. But I think you're right, those interjections where she says, I am now retyping this to send to America for safekeeping. The children are under the kitchen table because the house is shuddering. Those really give you a sense of the kind of the immediate moment being recorded on the spot. And I mean, I've worked on several other writers who kept diaries and who retyped them. And that seems to be itself a creative process, because of course they would have changed things as they were going along. And yet the bulk of it is based on that original manuscript. So in the case of Kennedy, there are manuscripts for a lot of her works available. I haven't been able to see a manuscript for this one, but I think we would probably find a reasonably small amount of changes from the manuscript diary.
Yeah. I wonder if Yale University Press have any correspondence or even editorial remarks about it.
This is a difficulty of the pandemic, because I have used the Kennedy archive quite a lot at Somerville College, and of course I wasn't able to go back and check whether there's anything there on this subject this time around. So.
Yeah. Yes, the pandemic has stopped a lot of things, but it's also made a lot of things possible in a bizarre way.
Us all being here.
Yeah, indeed. Lucy, I mentioned Inez writing not about women in the workplace and women in the institutional setting. What did you think about that? The way that she wrote about the people living in institutional hostels. How did that come across?
I mean, I think she's very much like she's like a sort of moving camera, isn't she? That phrase that gets used with Night Shift, that she has this wonderful ability of, I mean, clearly she is writing from firsthand experience. She herself worked in a munitions factory at some point. She did various other things that are talked about in the previous book. So she is writing from firsthand experience, but she's not sort of bringing herself into that. She's there watching, listening, learning. I mean, particularly in There's No Story There, she's a great one for listening, I think, to the conversations around her. She has some great passages where she replicates, or, you know, obviously we don't know if they're exactly real, but we can imagine that these are conversations she sort of listened to other workers having. And I think, if I remember correctly, one of the sort of praises of her at the time in reviews was that she had this wonderful eye and this wonderful ear for everything that around her. So I think that comes across wonderfully.
Yeah. Yes, the conversations, these long extended passages of dialogue which show everything. They're perfect storytelling, because they give you character, they give you personality, they give information, exposition. It is genius writing, but it seems so effortless.
Yeah, she really seems to be able to. I think that's what, I suppose that's also something that's so interesting about this novel to me, was the way that she sort of leaps between various characters, and all of them seem extremely fully realized in their own right, but also very easy to differentiate between. You know, there's always that worry that if you start there's too many characters, they start to sort of merge into one, or they all sound the same, and that's not the case here. She really manages to distinguish between them. And there are these little, she knows how to give these little details, you know, about the Austrian cook who's, you know, who can't, the Jewish cook who can't go back to Austria, and people are slightly wary of him, but that's sort of, you know, and then there's the guy who comes back from war who's traumatized, but he doesn't sort of tell his story to other people. And so you're weaving in and out, and she allows you to be able to sort of leap into their minds for a little bit, but also then to kind of pull you out again when you just, often when you're just starting to think, oh, I want to know a little bit more about this person. And so she's always dragging you in a little bit more, I think.
Yeah, every character has a story. She's been very careful to establish an identity based on their life, their story, their, you know, their preoccupation. You mentioned the Austrian cook, but is that, I can't remember now, is that the same as the poor guy who is so persecuted he sees letters chalked on the ground, which was a message by one of the girls for some other bloke, but he takes it as an anti-Semitic remark? Do you remember that?
I think they're separate, aren't they?
I think they're separate too.
Yes, I think they're two separate people. I think the Austrian cook is only more or less mentioned in passing, whereas that other character is somebody we learn a little bit more about.
Yes, Gluckstein.
That's right. Yes, Gluckstein.
Yeah, Gluckstein's story is told in little pieces here and there, but the reader is given so much sympathy. The reader is made to feel so sympathetic to this man because of the microaggressive anti-Semitic experiences he's had throughout his life. And she just drops that in quite carefully. And I was wondering, given that at this point, this is published in 1944, it's probable that at the time, Auschwitz had not yet been revealed to the British public. So what Inez Holden is doing here is making a pretty strong pro-Jewish, anti-Nazi stance. Well, who couldn't be anti-Nazi during the war? Before the British public really understood properly what the need for it was. Do you think that's uncommon? Do you think she was one of the first to do this?
I mean, I'm not an expert on that particular kind of area, so I'm sure there might be others, but I do think it was, as far as I'm aware, it does seem like it's fairly uncommon that early on, I think. I think a lot of the novels that we might read at that period and see characters being sort of sympathetic to the plight of the Jewish people at that point are often written a little bit after, when all the details have come out. And actually, from what I've read, I do think at the time there was not, just because you were anti-Nazi did not mean that you were pro-Jewish, put it like that. You know, there's a lot of kind of anti-Semitism in this country, and a lot of feeling about, you know, the you know, maybe we shouldn't be responsible for the Jewish people who are being persecuted. So it does strike me this is quite sort of radical for the time, and particularly and very, in that sense, I mean, maybe that's goes back to what you're talking about earlier, that her empathy is a sort of, there is empathy threaded throughout this book, but in a very genuine and very sort of subtle way, that I think that the more you talk about it, the more you think about these various characters, you realize that she's able to understand the plight of people who are very different to her, and whose lives she might not have had, you know, much experience of firsthand, but she's able to sort of, you know, to put herself in those shoes, you know, and that's incredible. I mean, that's also what makes her such a brilliant kind of social documentary writer.
Yeah, I was also very struck when I came across this very brief mention of two American soldiers laughing and joking with people in the bar and trying to swap stories about what each other's lives were like. And it's only at the end you realize, well, these are black soldiers, but Holden is not making a thing of it. The characters who the black soldiers are talking to really couldn't care less that they were black or white. It's the fact that they were American. That's their interest. That's their purpose in being there. And again, I wonder if this is relatively unusual, to not make a song and dance about the fact that the skin color is different. It's the foreignness that's the important thing.
I think so, but I think within that, there's also something about the way that, I don't know, people might disagree with me, but first and foremost, I sense that she is somebody, particularly with this novel, who she wants to write a novel that really brings you into that kind of experience, right? That puts you inside this factory or inside the kind of wider remit of it, and makes you see what these factory workers are seeing, makes you understand what their day-to-day lives are like. So therefore, I think that it doesn't make sense for her to sort of start preaching one way or the other. She's not going to start kind of going into some long talk about how, you know, we need to be nicer to the Jews, or we need to do X, Y, and Z. She actually just wants to reflect like daily life, and in a way that's I mean, it's heartening, I suppose, when you see these kind of elements of daily life happening and people aren't making big deals about things we might think they are. But I don't know. I mean, there's also that also has its limitations as well, right? We don't know necessarily what's going on behind the scenes. We just see these snapshots of people's lives for that moment.
Yeah. Yes, it's as you say, it's a camera passing over, and they're illuminated and then they're gone. And we don't
Yes.
really know what else is going to happen. Faye, on the same subject, I was very aware reading the Margaret Kennedy memoir that she always had a good word to say, even for the people she disliked, or even for the people who might have come across as being negative. For example, the glue bottoms, the people she called the glue bottoms, because they arrived in St. Ives or Porthmeron and then sat on their backsides and did nothing and expected things to be done for them. They didn't didn't muck in at all. But somehow she allows the reader to feel some kind of empathy, even for those. Do you remember that?
Yes, I feel she does try to give everybody's point of view, but at the same time, there's something a little bit anthropological here, and I think it's actually the same in Holden. We might describe this camera eye panning around, but actually they rarely let them off completely without any kind of analysis. And even when I think Kennedy's trying to be at her most sympathetic, like when she's describing the Cornish people in St. Ives, she says things like, there is always stir and drama and excitement among these swarthy Celtic people. At funerals, it is considered correct for the chief mourners to fling themselves frequently down in the road on the way to the cemetery. And, you know, this is meant to be a description of people that she thinks are great. But there's always this slight tone of kind of analysis and superiority there, which balances against what you described, Kate, of her attempt to see everybody else's point of view, which makes it difficult for her to subscribe to anything approaching to a kind of jingoistic patriotic position during the war. So she says actually she's kind of hampered by her ability to see everyone's point of view. But at the same time, I do detect this kind of continual analysis and really snobbery about the classes of people that she's describing around her.
Yeah, no, she is separate. She's an incomer because she has to be with her children and her nanny. And other people are incomers, but somehow she makes herself part of the community because she does voluntary work with the evacuated children and fails miserably at trying to control them because they are all over the cliff and causing havoc in all directions. She's not shy about making a fool of herself, about letting herself down, which is great.
Oh no, that's wonderful. She does mock herself a lot, and that's what really makes you warm to her, isn't it? Even though she might have a certain sort of analytical approach to everybody else, at the same time she's willing to join in and enjoy herself with them, and also to make herself the fool of the scene, if you like.
Yeah, very self-deprecating. How do you think she wrote a sense of place? Because we have two settings in this memoir. We've got Surrey, where she was when it opens, and then they moved to Cornwall. Did you pick up a strong sense of place, or do you think that was rather skated over?
No, I really do. I mean, she was very familiar with Cornwall, and that was why she went there during this period of evacuation. So there's a reference continually back to her own childhood holidays in Inez St. Ives. And I think her description of the beaches and the coastal scenery is very evocative. But I don't feel as if Surrey is the only place that she's longing for. I also feel she's longing for central London as well. So perhaps that's also overlaid in her descriptions of what she misses. It's not just her country home in Surrey, but the kind of literary life and the civilized life of London that I think is kind of an undertone there as well.
Yeah, and with her husband as well. Her husband making these flying visits from London. She never says what he does. In real life, her husband was a judge, and a fire watcher at night. But she cuts away all the unnecessary personal stuff so we can focus on the immediate situation. I'd like to bring Ariane in now. Just Ariane, going back to There's No Story There, do you have any insights into how Inez wrote There's No Story There? And what experience had she that brought this together as a novel?
I don't really. I bitterly regret the fact that I didn't really talk to her about her wartime writing because I was quite young when I knew her. I mean, I was a child growing up, and then she died when I was 20. When I was less than 20, when I was about 17 or 18. I actually can't remember the exact age. And if only I'd been older and had read more of her writings myself. I mean, obviously I knew she was a writer, and the thing about her was that she was also the most marvelous raconteur, and she was able to sorry, what's the word, when you can do every accent under the sun. I mean, she was a
ventriloquize. She
Impersonations.
yeah, I mean, she was so brilliant. She would tell these stories. She was fascinated by human life, really fascinated by people, fascinated by stories in the papers, fascinated by crime, fascinated by politics. She was just brilliant at impersonating people, as she would tell anecdotes or stories about them. She was extremely funny person. She was a marvelously funny person. So I obviously have complete fascination with people, with the way they talked, with what they said, with how they expressed themselves. Was, you know, that was what really sort of powered her on. And this book brilliantly reflects that. Her wonderful ear, as Lucy was saying, her wonderful eye. She was extremely observant. It was what made people tick that really got her up in the mornings.
Yes.
And but what I don't know is her working methods, and how whether this was very closely based on diaries that she kept at the time. I mean, to me, it does feel tremendously, I know it's a novel, but it feels tremendously autobiographical in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
And there is the character Geoffrey Doran, who is going around as, time and emotion studies, as she calls it, you know, taking notes of everything all of the time, and then nearly having a nervous breakdown when his notebook is inadvertently buried in the snow. So, you know, what I don't know, and I wish I did know, and I wish we all knew, was how much of that was really real and how much of that was invented.
Mm.
I don't know. Lucy, do you have a sense of it or not?
I don't know.
No.
I'm interested in why she chose to write about a vast munitions factory up north. Did she have any connection with the north at all, or do you think that was modelled on a real place and she elaborated it?
No, I think I think she transposed, because she did go to work in another ordnance factory in, was it Wiltshire or Gloucestershire? I think she probably just transposed a lot of her material to the north, but she really had very little experience of the north. I think we went on holiday there with her a couple of times, but she didn't. No, she hadn't spent any of her life there, as far as I'm aware.
Okay, right. Okay, Lucy, Faye, have you got any questions for each other about the respective books that you have introduced?
I have one for Faye, actually, if I may. I was just thinking of what you said earlier, Faye. I don't know Kennedy. I've been reading some of her recently, which I think I told you, and loving it. But I'm not particularly knowledgeable on what was written when. Was she writing novels during this period as well, or was she just writing the diary?
She was working on plays and film scripts during the 1940s mainly. Because there was quite a gap in her fiction writing. She wrote most of her novels in the 20s and 30s and then in the 50s. So during the 1940s, it has been thought to be a bit of a lull in her career, but actually she was working on drama, and some of her plays were broadcast on the radio at this time, and she was collaborating on adaptations of her novels into plays, which is interesting to me in relation to this book because there's such a lot of dialogue reported in it, and I feel as if she's really experimenting with recording speech and recording, you were talking about accents before, recording voices in particular. So yeah, this is a period of her career where she was doing different things, and there's also apparently somewhat of a gap between her interwar fiction and her post-war fiction. But perhaps we can see things happening in these 1940s texts which then perhaps changed her fiction practice in the later decades.
That's so interesting, because I think I've read more of her later fiction, but not so much of the earlier stuff. So I'd love to compare the two. But then you say that she wasn't, but in the diary, she's not writing about the other writing work she's doing. That's completely separate. I find that really fascinating. It's kind of as if she knew that this was a even though it was a diary, it was kind of autobiographical, that she was keeping it separate from her other writing work, right?
Yes, and not projecting an image of Margaret Kennedy, who was really a major celebrity because The Constant Nymph was so well known. And it was a scandalous book, really, because of its representation of an affair between a 14-year-old girl and an adult man. And then she was completely detached from that in this journal, where she was presenting herself as purely a sort of private woman, as an every woman almost that anyone could identify with. Whereas,
but presumably the people who she went to live with, you know, in the local area in Cornwall, must have known who she was, or would she have gone, or did she be going by a married name by that point? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, Mrs. Davis, it might not have been identifiable at all with Margaret Kennedy. And I think when she had been in Cornwall before, it was as a child, so perhaps not actually, not necessarily. So yeah,
that makes it all the more interesting, I think. I love that, of having the kind of separation between, I don't know, it's kind of fascinating.
Actually, what I wanted to ask you was kind of related, talking about drama and film, because we talked about Inez Holden as the camera eye, but also there's such a lot about cinema in the novel, isn't there, where the character herself is showing films to entertain the people working in the munitions factory. And then I read that Inez Holden, that was the role that she had in the factory where she worked, was she was responsible for the film showings to entertain the staff. And I was just thinking, is there more to say about the role of cinema in this text, sort of beyond the idea of the author as observing or camera eye? Is there something to be said about cinema as entertainment as well?
God, that's so fascinating, because that wasn't something I'd really thought about much while reading it or writing introduction, but you're completely right. It is, I think it becomes sort of important-ish towards the end, when you realize that there's this whole life of entertainment for I think also because so much of the story up until that point is about the actual day-to-day life in the factory, like where they eat, where they work, you know, these sorts of things. And then suddenly you see a little burst towards the end of how they spend their downtime, and some of that obviously is with these kind of the cinema girl who kind of, you know, puts the films on for them week by week. I guess I'd always assumed that it was part and parcel of, yeah, the sort of bigger documentary picture. I mean, cinema at that point, I presume if you're going to the cinema during this period, you're seeing, before you see the main film, you're seeing kind of reels of what's going on in Europe, fighting, and sort of, you know, newsreels, aren't you? So there's a sense of you're getting quite a lot of your information about life from that during this time. But then I suppose entertainment is something completely different. So you're both being kind of told about what's going on, but then you're getting your kind of, you're being sort of pulled out of that and allowed to do something very different. I don't know, Ariana, do you know if was Inez a big cinema fan? Was it something she ever kind of talked about? Did she like to go to cinema? Do you know anything?
Yes, I think she really enjoyed it, actually. I don't think it was a huge part of her life, but it probably had been during that time, during her time at the factory. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, very au courant with what was going on in film, and enjoyed going enormously.
I also wonder if cinema itself is such a wonderful place to go, or the cinema is such a great place to go and kind of people watch, even though it's very dark in a sense. You know, I love films that then do that thing where they pan out and they look at the audience watching, and you see, and particularly during this period, the idea that everyone's in there smoking their cigarettes and, you know, maybe trying to kind of have a snog on the back row. I don't know, it's a kind of, I think it's a great place to go and see people as much as it is to see films, right? It's
a great sort of social leveler, isn't it, really?
Yes.
You know, almost everybody from every class of life enjoys going to the movies, and of course that was the other thing, that she just was fascinated by the absolutely enormous range, as it were, of classes, and the way that they were, you know, intermingling during the war, thrown together in these extraordinary situations.
Oh, yeah, that's fascinating. We haven't talked that much about that, but of course the cinema would be that great leveler, wouldn't it? It's not, you know, high theatre, it's not high art, it's kind of not, and it's something everyone can do.
I think now we should open the floor to the audience and see, is anybody out there, would they like to ask questions? You can wave your hand. Oh, Maylin, I see your hand waving straight away. Maylin, do talk.
Hello. I haven't read either of these books yet, though I certainly will. I'm much more familiar with women's writing from the First World War, and I was wondering if these writers of the Second World War were building on any kind of literary history war writing from that First World War, because many of them would have lived through it, or at least their parents would have, or they'd been children during then, or they would have read the books, both by men and women. Certainly by the 40s, there would have been I don't want to say canon, but certainly would have been a body of World War I literature. And I'm wondering if the writers of World War II were building on that, changing it, influenced by it. Just curious.
So Faye, what do you think?
Well, Margaret Kennedy was at university at that time, and then she wrote several novels that were set in the pre-First World War period. So it almost seems as if she was trying to access a time kind of before that. There aren't a lot, there's actually surprisingly few references to the First World War in the text of this journal. There are a few kind of glancing references, particularly about what Germany did and what America did in the First War. But I haven't detected any particular kind of literary influences, unless anybody else who's read it can think of any. But I was actually slightly struck by the lack of them, and almost like a kind of reference back, sort of jumping back over the First World War to refer back to writing about 19th century conflict and kind of literary quotations from previous periods, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Very good question.
Yeah. Lucy, did you find anything resonating from the First War in the Holden book?
No, not so much. And again, I don't know, with Inez, I think it's slightly different as well, because one of the most fascinating things about her is sort of when she begins writing, she's writing novels which are, you know, the sort of things that bright young things in the 1920s and 30s are writing. And then suddenly in the 40s, she makes this amazing shift and starts writing these social documentary novels. And so actually, I don't know, I feel like that's the more interesting thing with her. I don't know, I'd love to know if she was a keen reader of sort of, you know, the types of books you're talking about. But it's certainly quite a different thing to the stuff that she started writing, let's say. So I haven't noticed, I'm reading this, I don't remember any particular resonances of my own. I'm trying to think. No, because I feel like also her way of writing about it as well is, you know, not so much the home front, but it is like about sort of a certain type of war work that is very specific to the Second World War. And also I think it's tied up with kind of broader politics from that period, which is slightly different, that maybe don't have the same sort of resonances or weren't around in the First World War. Perhaps.
Are there feminist politics in the Inez Holden book?
Not so much, but she was very interested in sort of more socialist politics and kind of, you know, on the like dancing on the edge of communism, like that sort of stuff, you know, that like kind of links with Orwell, with H.G. Wells, these sorts of things. So not overtly feminist, but I mean, you know, you know, you read these things and you read anything about her life. I mean, she's clearly a sort of feminist icon as far as I can see in many ways, even if she wouldn't, I don't know, would she say herself, Ariana? You know more than me. Would she call herself a feminist?
I don't think she would have called herself a feminist, no, okay. But she was, as you rightly say, Lucy, incredibly independent, always. I mean, she left home at the age of 15 and she made her way in the world thereafter with absolutely no support from anybody else. She never married, although she did have a very long, very important relationship with Humphrey Slater, who was himself a very interesting man, a painter, a writer, the editor of a journal called Polemic, a political journal called Polemic, which was very important in the mid-40s. But she lived on her own, and other than a short period when she lived with him, she was entirely independent. She earned her own money. She inherited virtually nothing from her parents. And she made her own way in the world. And so she was, as you rightly say, a feminist icon without ever calling herself, I think, overtly a feminist. But yes. I mean, she died in the very, very early 70s. So, well, not, of course, feminism was around in the 60s, of course. But yeah, I don't think she, by that stage, saw it as particularly applying to her.
No. I find those sort of women fascinating, the ones who lived these clearly incredibly independent lives, but would never have thought or even had maybe the opportunity to describe it as, you know, being actively feminist. And now, but the way that she lived is kind of so much more feminist than a lot of women today who would go out there and describe themselves as great feminists.
Deborah Ray, you had a question, I think, and you're muted.
I did have a question. My question is for Faye. Or actually it might be partly for you, Kate. And I wonder if either of you can say more about the genesis of this book as a publication. You talked about the grooming of the manuscript for, from perhaps its original form to its published version. But I'm wondering, was she herself a diarist routinely, or was this a diary that was always designed perhaps with an eye to publication? And if so, was it designed for publication in the United States? Because I'm thinking about books books or publications of the same period, like Molly Panter Down's work and some of Rebecca West's columns for the New Yorker, things that in a way were being sort of harnessed to give a picture of England to an America that was still, not really involved. So could you say more about this?
Paul, there is a foreword which Kennedy wrote to go with the text, which explicitly explains why she wrote it and what she wants the Americans to take from it. But that's clearly an afterthought, if you like. It wasn't. I don't think it was part of the original diary. And I suspect when I read it for the first time, my impression was that this had been very carefully selected and shaped, and I was quite interested, as I said already, to see these interjections from a later period stuck into the linear narrative, if you like. So this was a shaped and curated structured diary, but at the same time, it is so immediate and so heartfelt and just rings so true. I don't think any part of it was invented specifically for propaganda purposes. The other thing we need to remember is that, and it's so difficult for us to remember, as she was writing, she had no idea if she would be dead in a year because the Nazis would have invaded. So this sense of self-preservation and preserving the sense of England, you can see this also in Vita Sackville-West's book about the Canyon, and I've completely forgotten the title, came out in 1939, and I wrote something on it ages ago. But that too was written in the beginning of the war, not knowing if Germany would invade, and something had to be done. So you get this sense of, I'm on the edge, and I'm just giving my all because something has to be said about this moment. So this passionate need to be recorded, to be on the record, and to put that in a safe place, that came through very strongly when I first read it. Faye, what do you think?
Yes, I think your last point about putting it in a safe place is really crucial, that she felt that sending it to Julian Street, who was an American writer who she posted it to for safekeeping, the kind of material existence of this manuscript was really important. But there's a really interesting bit in the foreword that Kate mentioned where she says that she wants to remind American readers that this journal was written before the Lease Lend Bill was so much as dreamt of. And she says it must be as difficult for Americans to think themselves back into last year as it is for us. But she says she couldn't have imagined that cooperation between our two countries would go as far and as fast as it has done. So she was really trying to advocate for something which by the time the book was published had pretty much happened, I think, the greater cooperation. But this is a really interesting aspect, and the reason why it's never been published in the UK before this edition, because it was so much directed at American readers. So even though I agree with Kate absolutely that it doesn't feel like a propagandistic text, and it's got all these bits in it that are nothing to do with even the war at all, let alone American view of Britain, still it had a purpose. It's a purposeful text, and it's something that's designed to intervene politically, actually. So this is a really interesting question. There's lots more to say about this, but yeah, thank you for that one.
Thank you for that bombshell, Deborah. Are there any other questions?
We have a question from Ed in the chat.
Oh, thank you. I will read the chat. Let me rush to the chat. Oh, is that the one about the diaries?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I will read this. Celia Goodman, Ariane's mother, who was Inez's literary executor, remained tolerant of the countless researchers who arrived in pursuit of revelations about her famous friends, only discouraging them from climbing into the loft where the diaries of her cousin, the writer Inez Holden, another of Orwell's friends, were stowed. That comes from the obituary 06. I don't quite know which obituary. Anyway, Ed's question: is there any chance that Inez Holden's diaries might ever be published? Ariane.
I don't think there is, because they are very, very personal, and my mother certainly shared passages from them with various biographers and scholars and researchers over the years, but she felt, and I would honour that feeling, that a lot of it was too personal to go into the public domain.
Yeah. So not even an embargo. I mean, an embargo of 50 years.
No, I don't think so, really.
Okay.
They are mainly personal diaries, with obviously quite a lot in them about friends and politics and culture. But overall, I think that you know, they just shouldn't be published.
No, that's
Really.
yeah, it's perfectly reasonable. That's what you think ought to happen. That's what will happen. Thank you for that. Any other questions in chat, or yes, Sue, you've got your hand up.
Hello, I'm thinking about Inez's political awareness, which she expresses particularly in There's No Story There, and also the gender. She isn't particularly in favour, talking about feminism. She's not particularly biased towards women. Some of them are very silly women, and yet some of the men are very analytical. Although they don't have discussions, they give lectures to each other almost. But I'm just wondering about her own politics. Is she expressing her uncertainty through the voices of some of the people in those factories, and they're not firmly clear about things, except for the bloke who's always quoting Marx and Lenin. But there is this ambivalence about it all. But you've got to hate fascists, but the rationale isn't always quite clear. I just wondered about her own politics, really, coming out in that context.
What do you think, Ariane?
Me again. I think she was very clear about her politics, actually. She was very left-wing. She didn't ever join, she wasn't a card-holding member of the Communist Party, but she was absolutely on the left and of the left, and she remains there her entire life. I think that's very much borne out by the fact that she chose to write about and give a mouthpiece to people mainly of the working classes, who she was much more interested in than she was in people from any other classes, frankly. And I think that I don't see any real ambiguity there in her position, as revealed in these books myself. I think they absolutely reflect what she was interested in and where she was ideologically coming from. But I don't, Lucy, if you agree with that or not.
No, I do agree with that. I was just wondering whether what's interesting about it, or what makes it sort of seem kind of what makes one want to kind of think about it more, is because she doesn't have that thing of sort of romanticizing the working classes, which I think does happen a lot with people particularly from sort of more the upper classes in those days, without naming any particular names here. But there is that sort of sense of romanticizing them, or sort of or either kind of pitying them. And actually, what she does, I think, is she's very clear that she has her politics. This is why she's interested in looking at these people and looking at their lives and portraying them very faithfully and very kind of realistically. So sometimes, yes, some of the conversations or some of the characters might come across as, it could be that, we might want to read that as her own sort of ambiguity or her own kind of concerns, but actually she's just writing what she hears, I think, or what she sees. And these are people who are kind of asking their own questions and, maybe not always coming down on exactly the same side of things that she would, perhaps.
I think that's absolutely true. Exactly. She's reflecting what she picks up around her.
Thank you. Is there another question? I'm going to flip over to my other screen in case I'm missing people waving their hands.
I think Jeff's got one here.
Oh.
Yes, on the topic of politics, there's one scene in the book toward the end where there's a long speech from the director of the boiler room, he's called, who is giving his experience as an anti-fascist fighter somewhere. And she begins by saying he's not from Central Europe. He goes on with his dialogue, and in the end it gets interesting because wherever he is, when the fascists come in and have more or less defeated his group, he goes to the leader and says, "What should we do?" And the leader is busy trying to find another anti-fascist group to change to so that he ends up, seeming successful. Then the boiler room director concludes what he has to say, and it sounds like she was talking about the Spanish Civil War. That's just where I put it into context. But then she takes it out of that context by saying that that's where he went next. I wonder if anyone else had any thoughts about that passage and what the message was supposed to be, because I thought I was getting a message and then it was cut off.
My goodness. So which was the anti-fascist conflict that preceded the Spanish Civil War?
The only one I could think of was Austria, but she says it wasn't in Central Europe because there was a sort of civil war in Austria before the Nazis took over. And then there were, street fights, but maybe she just didn't want to have it connected to any specific area, but wanted the message to be more neutral.
Maybe. So before the Angelos is what you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. Is there a historian in the house who could happen to help? Because I have no idea. I'm lamentably ignorant about that. I think you've given us a question to take away and research ourselves, Jeff. That's a good thing. Okay, I think one more question. Anybody want to throw something in? Wave your hands happily. No? Okay, no, I think we're done. Right. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop the recording now, but don't go away because there's something else to say. But recording stops now.